All right, welcome everybody. My name is Joanne Snap, and today we are going to talk all about how to build a competency-based application for med school. And I'm glad you're here. I don't know if you know what this means, but I think you're going to find out very soon that this is going to be really, really helpful in helping you conceptualize how your entire application is going to be screened and considered by medical schools. So what we're going to do today is we're going to sort of talk through the evolution of how med schools have evaluated applications, and then we are going to look specifically at how the current approach to reviewing applications, how you can build that process into your application so that you might stand out in this process. So for those who don't know anything about me, I'm joining UCR for the next 10 or so weeks now. My background has been both admissions and advising. I spent 4 years as the director of admissions at an allopathic med school in New York, Zucker. Some of you might have heard of that. I also spent 6 years up at UC Davis serving as a pre-health advisor, the director there. And so all of my experiences and background have informed what I'm about to tell you today. Most of what I'm going to share with you today has actually come from my admissions role, though. So this is going to be an interactive session. I'm going to need you to participate on some level because otherwise it's going to get really awkward. So you can either unmute yourself and answer my questions, or you can post them in the chat. So very quickly, what do you think med schools are looking for in your application? What are the things they're looking for? I just want to open the floor. Service, yeah, that's absolutely right, Nicholas. That's it. Just gotta do service. Scores, yeah. We call those metrics. I don't know about shadowing, but definitely experiences. Shadowing is a great thing to do, but I'm not sure very many schools actually count quantify your shadowing, as in they have a minimum hours or anything like that. I think they just look at it. Why are we becoming a physician? So your why, experiences in the field, good grades. Okay, so these are a lot of the basics, right? Your grades, your experiences, your why. So I'm gonna probably challenge some of this a little bit today, which is good. It'll be good for you to conceptualize another way that they're looking at your application. So a long time ago, back before the AAMC, and everybody knows what the AAMC is, right? The big overarching umbrella organization that runs med schools. Before they imposed the holistic review upon medical schools, back in the good old days, the way schools screened applications, I'm being a little facetious here, is they used to take all the applicants and they would rank them by highest to lowest, right? They would take all the scores, the GPAs and the MCATs, and they would sort them. And then they would just draw a line and they would take the highest numbers. That was before the holistic review. That seems fair, I guess, right? Like if you did the best in school, then you should have the best chance of getting in. That's how people thought about that. However, in doing that, we started to see, and it took a couple of decades to realize this, that there were some major problems in the American healthcare system. We started to notice that there were health disparities between groups, and that America actually didn't have the best health outcomes, and that there were a lot of major problems in healthcare. Are you all on the same page with me? You know what I'm talking about? Give me a thumbs up if you are aware of those problems. Okay, excellent. Okay, so they started to think and talk and consider things, and then way back when I first started at the School of Medicine, they implemented. This was back in 2010. They started to roll out this thing called the holistic review. And I was actually one of the few schools that was initially trained to do the holistic review. I remember the AAMC coming out to our school. We had to sit through 2 full days. So I became a holistic review trainer, and then I was training our admissions committee on how to be holistic. And what the holistic review basically meant was that it's not just metrics that we have to take into consideration. So people often thought that, oh, when a school does holistic, that means that, my weak MCAT, my weak GPA can be balanced with my experiences and my attributes. That wasn't exactly what was happening, though. We saw that metrics still stayed very important, but now, in addition to having decent metrics, and I'll define what that means, you also had to have decent attributes and decent experiences. And every single year I saw, and I still do to this day, I see people who have, 3.99 GPAs and 515 MCATs who are not getting into any med school, 520 MCATs, numbers off the charts, and they're not getting into any medical school. They're not getting interviews, they're not getting accepted. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people with numbers off the charts would not get into medical school? Ariana, you said that good grades and good scores are what they're looking for. So if that's true, how come they wouldn't get in? What about it? What about their... Well, so Shava says no experience. Usually really smart pre-meds know that they have to do certain things. Usually it's hard to get through this cycle or get through this process being pre-med without hearing that you're supposed to do certain things, right? So maybe they did checklist things, right? Maybe they did research and shadowing and volunteer work and an internship. They did all the things they thought they were supposed to do. They checked off all the boxes to look like the perfect pre-med. So they had all the good experiences. They had all the good numbers. And then Shava said no attributes. I don't know how we can exist on Earth with no attributes, but what kind of attributes do you think they would be looking for? Can you think of a person perhaps who has really, really high stats, really great GPA, really brilliant person, but struggles to like make connections with people, or struggles to talk to people in a nice way, or interpersonal skills, has no compassion, maybe a sociopath. So there are some things in people that no matter how good they do, no matter how smart they are, if you don't have certain attributes, those became apparent in the application and those people were not making the cut. So in some ways, the holistic review made it harder for some people, right? Because it wasn't just about numbers anymore. And that threw a whole bunch of people for a loop because, everyone was writing on the fact that if I just did really well in school, I should be able to get in. And that wasn't the case for several years. Many people didn't get in because they lacked other things. So the holistic review's been around for more than 10 years now. You've probably heard, med schools say, oh, we take a holistic approach to your application. Give me a thumbs up if you've heard them say that before. Some of you have. Yeah, it's a very common phrase. And I remember sitting in on a presentation one time. It was by the AAMC's lawyer. So the AAMC has their own lawyer. And they were doing a presentation on why medical schools are required to use the holistic review. And basically the point of the presentation was, you must use holistic review because it allows you to accept whoever you want without fear of being sued. So if you want to take any person for any reason, you can take them and you don't really have to explain it as long as you can attach it to your mission statement. So go look at the mission statements of the schools, and what word do you think appears in every single mission statement? I'll give you a hint. It starts with a D. Diversity. That's right. You probably had to look a couple up, didn't you? So this is the chart that we used to use at the med school. I stole it when I left. I mean, you can probably find it online. But this is the chart that med schools use to train the admissions committee on how to do holistic review. So if you look in the center, of course, MCAT and GPA are there. But in addition to MCAT and GPA, it's not just the GPA. Look at that center ring. Grade trends. Does everybody know what an upward trend means? That's where your last 2 years of your GPA is much higher than your first 2 years. That's only applicable if your first 2 years weren't, great. Like if you had a 3.1 your first year and a 3.2 your second year, they would expect that your third year and your fourth year would be higher than that, right? If you had a 3.6 your first year, that's fine. If you have 3.6 for 4 years, that's a great GPA. You don't need to worry about a grade trend. But for a lot of people, their first couple of years of college don't go so well. And that's really normal, very, very normal. So what they do, instead of just looking at the GPA, they look at your grade trend. They look at how much it got better. So that's at the center of everything. You're not going to get by without having a baseline MCAT and a baseline GPA. What is the baseline MCAT that most schools use to screen for secondaries? What number? The faster you answer, the faster we move through this presentation. What baseline MCAT? I have never heard of a school screening at 508. That is way too high. Maybe the Ivy Leagues. Nicholas and Sheva are correct. So most schools are going to screen at a 500. I've had people with 499 MCATs get into UCLA with the full ride. So even though they don't have a 500, there are, in some cases, ways that schools will still screen below that. But I'm just giving you a general number. If you want a number to say, this is the minimum that most schools look for, would be a 500 MCAT. And then for GPA, the base number is usually a 3.0. So that would be the number that would allow them to then look beyond your metrics at the other things. So I want you to look at the second thing they look for. Look at the attribute ring. What in that middle ring is there anything in there that kind of surprises you, or you wonder, like, why would they want to know that? Like, why would they be considering that? Does this surprise anybody in terms of what they're looking at? I don't see curiosity. Intellectual curiosity. Yeah, so that's your your will. You're wanting to learn things, right? Like that makes sense. You want to learn things. You're like a lifelong learner. Faith, okay. Family status, physical ability, relationship status. So Nicholas, why? Any ideas? Does anybody have any ideas why they would be looking at someone's religion and seeing the value in that? And you guys are free to unmute yourself and talk too. It'd be probably a little bit richer in our conversation if you were talking. No, it's not just religious schools. A lot of schools look at your faith, and I encourage everyone to talk about their faith if they have a faith. It's not that faith dictates your values. I mean, faith definitely dictates your values, but you don't get to decide. Your values don't dictate your care. For example, you don't get to decide how you treat someone or whether you do a procedure or not. All of that is mandated by policy and law. So whatever state you're practicing in, you're going to do whatever the law mandates. Your personal beliefs and your personal religion have nothing to do with that. But your religion and your beliefs do have an impact on your ability to make medicine accessible and safe for people who share that faith. So for example, if you come from a Muslim faith and you understand that Muslim women sometimes would prefer to be treated by fellow women. If you don't know that, you have no understanding of that, and you don't come from the same faith, you might end up treating someone poorly, or you might have some implicit bias, or something might get in the way of that relationship because it's just you don't understand that, right? So having a lot of different faiths represented in a medical school class and in a healthcare workforce increases the odds that patients who come in from different faiths are going to have some representation within the healthcare field. There's going to be someone in that hospital, someone on that floor who understands how they believe and what they're going through. And so it goes back to that D word, right? We want diversity in our medical schools. So anything that you bring that sort of sets you apart from, and it's not that you have to be truly unique. I think that's the fear everybody has, is like, oh, I'm just an average person. I don't have anything But it's your combination of things that make you unique. It's where you're coming from. What did your home life look like? Pair that with your lived experiences. Pair that with your college experiences. Maybe your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your faith, the languages you speak, relationship status is your like whether you're married or not. Believe it or not, but people who are married are actually pretty attractive to med schools, and so there's like a whole strategy for applying when you're married. Nicholas, I don't agree with that at all. I think that that's a pre-med myth that's out there. Mariana, that's choose wisely. That's all I have to say. There are so many pre-med myths out there about things like this, and it's absolutely not the case that you have to hide your religion from schools. Think about doctors. Like, doctors have religion. They're people. They're real people with lives. And so if your religion has something to do with the way that you see the world, then I think it would be worth talking about. I once had a student come in who told me that he told me the same thing. Oh, I can't talk. He's Buddhist. And he said, I can't talk about my religion. I was told I can't talk about that. I was completely debunked that. I was like, absolutely not. You can talk about that. He ended up rewriting his whole personal statement. Said he was pre-dental, and he talked about how he wanted to use the tenets of Buddhism to create a practice that addressed like patient anxiety. And he was like describing what the space looked like, and it was just really compelling because he pulled from his experiences to show why his Buddhist faith would add value to him as a dentist and his space, his creating that safe and comforting space. He ended up getting interviews everywhere. He got interviews at Harvard. He went to UCSF. So in no way did his entire personal statement being based on his Buddhist faith impair his ability to get into dental school. I have students right now I'm working with who are Muslim, and they're writing all about treating Muslim women or just understanding different issues with religion. So I think that that's one of those things where if you do come from even Christianity, you don't have, for some reason, a lot of my Christian students feel like they can't talk about that either. I think it's not that you're telling people, you're not on a pulpit like preaching your religion. You're simply talking about how your worldview brings value to the perspective that you bring to the school. Someone else mentioned distance traveled. That's not like studying abroad or how many states you've been to. That is where you came from in life and how much you had to overcome to get to the point you're at now. So, for example, if your life was pretty well paved for you, everything was laid out, you got to go to summer camps, you got test prep, you got all the help you needed, no, you didn't have to worry about working. Compare that to someone who had to work from a young age, take care of siblings, did not get access to any camps or any tutoring or anything, worked their way through everything, maybe failed, got back up, tried again. That is the distance traveled that they're interested in knowing about. No, it's not that any of this, like if you don't have this, it doesn't make you unattractive. What we're talking about is identifying the value that people bring to a school. So, for example, if you belong to the LGBTQ community, it's not like if you're not part of that community, you're suddenly unattractive. But if you are part of that community, now you have an added value to the application process. Or to the school. So anything that you can mention in your application that adds value to them, like if you can speak more than one language, if you have immigrated to America, if you grew up in a bilingual household or bicultural household and you understand multiple cultures, all of that is added value. So this is the old way. I mean, it's still being used, but this is the way that schools have historically gathered attributes. So now we're going to switch gears and oh gosh, when was this? This was, not long after the holistic review came out. There started to be some chatter about competencies. And what competencies are, it's saying, okay, so you have this amazing life story and you bring this value and you have this perspective, but can you actually do anything? Like, do you have any skills? And so the competencies were developed. The AAMC surveyed the medical schools, and they said, we need to get on the same page and make sure that all of you are looking at similar things when you're selecting candidates. And so after several years of developing, the med schools came up with these 15 core competencies that are basically saying, okay, we agree these are the things we want to measure in our applicants. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through these, and I want to talk about how some of these can show up in different parts of your application. And I would really love if any of you would share and talk about how you've seen some of this show up in your college experiences and just the things that you've done. So before I go any further, have any of you heard of the 15 core competencies before? Nicholas has? Okay. Shava have. So, Chelsea, great. Okay. If you have, all of you should do this, but if you Google AAMC 15 core competencies, a sheet will come up that will be a really nice printout. You can print it out and tape it to your wall. I literally want you to print these and stare at these. I want you to know these. I want you to eat, sleep, and drink these 15 core competencies, because a lot of people sit around and wonder, like, what are the med schools really looking for? Like, what do they want from us? This is it. They have literally made a handout that says, this is what we want from you. And so it's not a mystery. It's not anything we have to try to figure out. There's no formula for this. There's no Lizzie M score. This is what they're looking for. And so if you print this out and you hang it on your wall and you stare at it and you think about it, I want you to try in all aspects of your application, from personal statement to secondaries to interviews, I want you to try to manifest some of this within your application, because this is what they want, right? So there are 4 categories within the 15 core competencies, and I'm not going to read all of these word for word to you. So I'm going to give you a second to just skim your eyes over them and read them. And then I would love to know first I'm going to ask you, do you have any ideas for how any of this shows up in your application? How does someone show social skills in your application? Okay, so that one is demonstrating an awareness of others' needs, goals, feelings, and the way that social cues affect people's interactions and behaviors. Adjust behaviors appropriately in response to these cues. Treats others with respect. Well, I actually read this all the time, where people are in your personal statement. Let's say you're telling me a story about you being in a room with a patient, and you sense that that patient is feeling really uncomfortable. And so rather than just like pushing through what you were doing and ignoring the fact that this patient is like awkwardly, uncomfortable and it's really obvious, you recognize that and you stop and you change your behavior, you sit down with them, you have a conversation, you do something, and you try to show them respect. I've actually seen entire personal statement paragraphs devoted just to this concept of treating all people with dignity and respect. It's a really good theme. It's a really amazing thing to talk about. It could be in your essays, and it can actually be in your experience descriptions as well. So if you had, like, let's say you were a CNA or you were a personal caregiver, or even being a tutor or a teacher, right? If you're tutoring someone and you notice that someone's falling behind and they have a glazed look on their face, look at this. It's behavioral cues affecting people's interactions and behaviors. Can you adjust your behavior appropriately? So it's like, can I read the room? Can I understand when someone is not doing okay? It seems really basic when you put it down like that, but you can imagine why this is so important as an attribute or a competency in medical school, right? Because once you get to medical school, they don't have time to teach you how to do these things. They do not have time to teach you how to read people, how to talk to people, how to think. They have so much science they have to teach you and so many clinical skills you have to learn in a very short amount of time. So they expect that by the time you get to them, you are already good at these things. So what you want to do in your application is show them that you are actually already good at these things, that you're not looking forward to doing it. You are already doing it. You have done it already in your past. A lot of people tell me that they are nervous about like public speaking, things like that. And I think that oral communication makes you think of public speaking. I don't know if it's exactly like that, but you could see it says recognizing potential communication barriers and adjust appropriate clarifies information. A really common theme I read in a lot of people's applications are things about linguistic appropriate care. So if you are bilingual, being able to decrease barriers by sharing a language with somebody. Also, oftentimes in healthcare settings, maybe the physician or the PA or whoever is talking and explaining things, but maybe the patient isn't always understanding. So recognizing that and then clarifying information, explaining things in ways that are accessible. So we're talking about increasing access, making science accessible to people. That's a form of oral communication that you could highlight. So whenever you do this in your application, you're not going to literally announce, using oral communication, I blah, 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 blah. You're just going to know that when you tell that story that leads to some takeaway, you are demonstrating a competency. So in our application, we just want to be deliberate about what we're doing. We want to be aware that when we do something, we're using a competency or we're not. A lot of people focus in on things like empathy and passion. Where do you see empathy and passion on this list? It's not really, right? Empathy itself is a feeling. And if you have a feeling like I feel empathetic towards you, the empathy that I feel is going to manifest as a behavior. So rather than saying I showed them empathy, which is saying like I felt empathy towards them, instead describe how you behaved towards them, and that's the competency. So an empathetic behavior would be something like using your social skills, increasing the understanding through communication. That would be the demonstration of that. I bet most of you have cultural competence, working with people different from yourself. What is even more impressive, these are kind of old. A new phrase that's more prevalent right now is cultural humility. So cultural competence suggests knowing. So competence is like, I'm good at that already. But cultural humility is, I don't know. I need to learn about that. And so if you meet someone new, it would be much safer to assume the position of cultural humility and say, I don't know anything about your background. I don't know your religion. I don't know anything. Could you please explain that to me? Rather than making assumptions and operating on assumptions about people. And so that's another thing, that if you have the ability to write about that in your application anywhere, personal statement, experience writing, secondaries, in your interviews, I would absolutely encourage you to talk about cultural humility. All right, so now we're talking about our relationship with other people, and this to me seems a lot more focused on our superiors. So I'll give you a second to read and ask any questions about any of these. So my favorite of these is capacity for improvement. When I worked at the medical school, I remember the dean of the medical school, Dr. Smith. He constantly talked about the number one thing. He'd come into our office, in the admissions office, and he always had something to say. He always wanted to tell us, make sure you're taking people who do blah, 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 blah. So he would come in and he would say, the one thing I want you guys to look for this year when you're doing your selection is I want you to look for people who can take direction. He felt very strongly that people who already felt like they knew everything and that they already were smart and that they didn't need anyone telling them what to do or how to do it, that those were the most dangerous future doctors. And you might know people like that, right? Who can't take any feedback. Maybe it's an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend where you're like, you have a problem. And they're like, no, I don't. You have a problem. So people who can't grow, who can't get criticized, who can't take negative feedback and run with it, who get really defensive and even angry. Think about that yourself, right? Like if you're working in a job and someone tries to correct you, how do you respond to that correction? Do you get defensive? Do you get annoyed? Or do you say thank you? You know, that's really helpful. I really want to get better at this, so I appreciate that feedback. And if you are in that first set where you still kind of get a little tiffy when people tell you things that you do wrong, you might think about that, right? Like that's a competency that the med schools are looking for, your ability to take feedback. You can imagine in med school, you're going to get a lot of feedback, and some of it's not going to be framed very nicely. Like if you're in a busy, if you're in your clinical rotations, the doctor doesn't have time to sit down and make sure you feel good. They're going to tell you if you're about to hurt a patient by doing something wrong, they're probably going to bark at you and tell you not to do that. So you can't get upset and cry every time someone tells you did something wrong. You're going to have to be able to bounce back, which is the next most important one, of resilience. You can't have resilience. Everybody knows what resilience is, right? The ability to bounce back. You can't have resilience if you haven't struggled and failed. And I think so many pre-meds are so focused on being perfect, trying to be perfect. Even if they're not perfect, they try to appear to be perfect. And what that usually means is that they try to hide any imperfections from the med schools. So for example, if you did research, and let's say you totally botched all of your data and you had to start over and you totally messed up. It was your fault, you made a mistake. You could either tell a story about how that happened in your research lab and it was a disaster, you were so embarrassed, everyone was mad at you, but you learned to cross-check your work every time. You learned something really valuable, and you learned that you can bounce back. You just had to do it again. It took some time. You could either do that, or you could tell this glorious story of how important your research is and how it made such a big impact on this whatever, and you could list all these really technical phrases that it will make you sound really smart and impressive. There's two ways you can go about it. One of them makes you sound really smart and impressive, and one of them shows you crashing and burning and failing. Which do you think would be more attractive to a med school? I would love to hear why you say that, Ariana, but yes, you are absolutely correct. In many of the secondary questions, they actually straight up ask you, tell me about a time you failed at something. And I've had so many students in the past where I asked this question and they like freeze. They're like, I've never failed. I'm like, okay, that's really scary if you've never failed at anything. You have got to have failed at something in your life. Failed at a friendship, failed at a relationship, failed at class, gosh, it's like life is so long. You've got to have messed up sometime. If you have not, and you know someone who literally cannot say that they've ever messed up, that is actually a major red flag to a med school. So if you're writing a secondary and you think in your head, I'm not going to show them my worst mistakes, I'm going to make myself sound like I made a mistake, but it actually turned out for the better, that is not failing. That is trying to avoid failing, and that's a red flag. So if you get asked about failure in your secondaries, let them have it. Give them like your worst failure. Show how you totally crashed and burned. You totally messed that up. Let all the feelings out. Be vulnerable, and then talk about how you grew from it. We don't need to try to take a failure and make it seem like it wasn't that bad and you actually were better. We are trying to show how you grew as a person from that failure. You adapted. There's a slight difference there. But these are things that we want to think about, right? Like as we're going through this application process, if you're aware that this is what they're measuring in you, then you don't have to be afraid of talking about that. There's nothing in the world to be afraid of when we talk about showing struggle. These are some other ones. So these seem really straightforward. Critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, scientific inquiry, and then written communication. There's a reason why they require 1 year of English, and they also require 1 year of chemistry. They require as much writing as they do biology. Have you ever thought about it that way? So, why do you think they require so much writing? Do you think it's just a personal statement? I doubt it. The personal statement and the experience writing in the secondaries, they usually know most people get help with that. So they kind of expect that those are like half your words, half someone else's words. They're well edited. So some schools actually give you writing samples on the interview day. They'll give you a writing prompt and make you write something on interview day to measure your writing ability. But writing is extremely important in medicine. You have to write letters to insurance companies. You have to write your notes. You have to write, if you're being sued, you're gonna have to write statements. So writing is a big part of medicine. You're gonna spend probably 50% of your time at a computer in your career. So being able to type fast and being able to form your thoughts in cohesive sentences is a skill that they're looking for. And then scientific inquiry and quantitative reasoning, those are the science classes and the math classes that you take. How do you demonstrate that competency? Super easy way. Your courses, right? So you take all the science classes to demonstrate your ability to do science. And in your letters of recommendation for your science faculty, more than likely they don't have anything to say about you because they don't know you. So all they're going to say is that you're able to do science classes. That's what the letters of rec from the science faculty are doing. They're commenting on that. Critical thinking can be shown through all kinds of parts of your application. I would argue that thinking is probably one of the top attributes that they're looking for in people. So first, your ability to take direction. Second, your ability to bounce back after failure. Third, your ability to think. They would much rather have thinkers than memorizers. And if you can reason and think, which is what like the SJT, the preview does, that's what the CASPER test is doing. It's measuring your critical thinking. Your secondary questions, a lot of your secondary questions are going to be not straightforward. Like some of them are, one of the questions that I really love is, what would you do if one of your peers in med school was making racist comments? Like you really have to think about what you would do. And so these are really difficult questions now that are forcing you to show your reasoning skills. And then last but not least, this is kind of following up with what I just said, your science competencies. So your ability to know science is going to be demonstrated through the MCAT. And then human behavior is the psychology and sociology courses that you're taking. They want to know that you understand how the world operates outside of science, right? Like people's interactions with each other. And this is where topics like social determinants of health, health disparities, cultural humility, those really important big topics come into play. And they want to know that you know that stuff as much as you know the biology and the chemistry and the physics. I feel like there is a lot of pressure to take a course load full of medically relevant courses. I would argue yes, Ariana. I think that it is just as important to take. So once you've taken, if you're doing it for your major, that's one thing. If you have to take a full load of science because you're trying to graduate, that's a thing, right? If you are done with your major requirements and you're choosing right now classes to take, I would ask you two questions. I would say, have you taken a full load of science and done well? So meaning, have you taken 3 or 4 science classes at the same time and demonstrated your ability to handle that rigorous course load? If the answer is yes, then you're done. You don't need to do that again. You've already demonstrated that. So at that point, I would say it would be more beneficial to you to take classes like bioethics, sociology, any class related to race, sexual identity, anything about health, so public health, epidemiology. Those would be much more valuable classes to add on to your ability to do science. If you have yet to demonstrate an upward trend or an ability to handle a heavy science course load, then I would do that until you're able to demonstrate that. That would be your primary goal first. After you've demonstrated that, then you can mix in. And you can mix it in. You don't have to take 4 science classes, right? Like you can take 2 science classes and 2 behavioral science classes, but at some point you want to show that you can do science well. That's always the goal. You don't have to do it for like an entire year. You just need to do it 1 or 2 times to demonstrate that. And that usually happens in your junior or senior year. Does that answer your question, Ariana? I know that pressure is there, but it really does depend on the person. Okay, so I want to talk about your experience writing. In your 600 or 700 character descriptions, depending on if you're applying to osteopathic or allopathic, they're different, you are going to write a description that's going to have half what did I do and half what did I learn. Now, does everybody here know who Mary Poppins? And I know that's a very cultural, old school movie. I grew up watching it, and I'm a little old. Has anybody heard of Mary Poppins? Yes? Okay, great. Excellent. I'm not that old. Yay! So, in this movie, this nanny-like lady, she's magical, she has this big bag. And in her bag, every time she goes to a new house, out comes stuff, right? Like everything she needs, medicine and umbrellas, everything she needs to be in that house. This is what I want you to think about. All of you are going to have a Mary Poppins bag. And as I'm reading your 15 experiences, I want you to think about what are you putting inside your Mary Poppins bag. Each experience is going to produce one takeaway. And that takeaway is going to be something that's going to help you in medical school and as a physician. So the takeaway is going to be it's going to be something you can pick up and carry with you into your future. So you're going to carry your Mary Poppins bag with you into med school, and as a doctor, you're going to open it up later and start to pull out these really useful things that you got from your experiences. So when you are writing them, I want you to, again, think about the competencies, but really we're trying to zoom in a little bit even more specific, and we're trying to show a takeaway that's something you're going to use in your future. So it could be something like, this experience taught me how to speak up in moments of conflict. That's really useful, right? There's going to be lots of conflict in your future. So that's one takeaway. You put it in your bag. Next experience could be, this experience showed me the importance of detailed note-taking in the medical records, if you're a scribe, let's say. Okay, that's really helpful because you understand how detailed note-taking can actually impact reimbursements and whether the patient's going to have to pay for their care or not based on their insurance reimbursements. So that's a really valuable lesson to learn. That goes in your bag. There are so many, right? There's millions of takeaways that you could get from your experiences. So when you think about your 15 experiences lined up, I want you to think about them, about what your takeaway is, kind of before you're done, right? So next to each one, you can literally just write like summarize takeaway, like public speaking, critical thinking, ability to communicate with peers. So all these various takeaways. You don't want to have the same takeaway more than once because you got 15 different ones you can take away. So why would you repeat anything? What is a takeaway that I do not want to see in your 15 experiences? This experience reaffirmed my desire to become a doctor. This solidified my desire to become a doctor. This made me want to be a doctor. By the time I get to your experience writing, guess what? I already know you want to be a doctor. You took the MCAT. No one does that for fun. You took OChem. No one takes OChem unless they want to be a doctor. No, I'm just kidding. There's other people. And you paid all this money to apply. You did the application. So I know you want to be a doctor, okay? There's no doubt in my mind about that. All I'm trying to figure out is what do you bring to the table? What skills do you have? And so when you think about your experience descriptions as Mary Poppins bag, right? Like what are you going to add in your bag? Then you're focusing on those takeaways and it helps control you so that you don't end up just kind of resorting to this made me want to be a doctor. Because there's so many more things about you than just the fact that you want to be a doctor, right? Like you're good at so many different things and you want to showcase as many of those things as you can. And then for your meaningful description, what you're doing is you're telling a story that shows the actual prompt for that is what is the transformative nature of this experience. So you're showing a change that occurred within you. You're showing how this experience helped you transform in some way. So when you think about your 3 changes, because you get 3 meaningful, so you have 3 different changes. Go back and look at your competencies. Are all 3 of those changes a competency? Can you manage how you have changed through that story? And if it's something that they're looking for, that's great, right? Like you've shown them, okay, this experience made me better at X. X is what you're looking for, med school. Again, you're not saying that explicitly, but you know that. You know they're looking for that. So then you can deliberately manage that in your application. Is all of this making sense to everybody? Okay. I'm really passionate about this topic, if you can't tell. I think this is the way of the future. So many people in the past have just resorted to telling people, I want to be a doctor, or I did this thing and this made me want to be a doctor. And then they just keep repeating over and over and over. I did this and it reaffirmed my desire to be a doctor. I did this and it reaffirmed my desire to be a doctor. And that's such a, I don't want to say useless, but it's just not a very helpful way for someone to pick you because they're not learning anything more about you. So when you write your application, when you write your personal statement, I want you to think about your why as forward facing. So our past led us to the decision, but the reason why you want to be a doctor is because it's why you want to wake up every day and go do that job. So we're looking to the future. Why do you want to go to this job? Well, I want to do something. I want to solve some problem. I want to do it this way. I want to address this issue. I want to serve these people. There's some reason why you want to do this. Most people apply for jobs because of some goal they'd like to accomplish. So try as much as you can to turn around and face forward when you think about why you want to be a doctor. Don't look at your past. The past led you to this decision, but your why has to be going forward. So your paragraph is going to tell a story. It's going to come to some realization, learning, lesson, something about you. And that thing that you learn, again, what am I going to say? Put it through the filter of the competencies. How has this thing made you want to be a doctor, and what is it that you are going to do with this opportunity? Like, how are you going to be good at this? Any questions about that? I know that's very different than other advice you might have gotten from other sources. Are there competencies that we should try to focus on more, emphasize those in our meaningful? That's a very subjective question because we're talking about human beings who are reading your application. So the AdCom doesn't read applications. The AdCom is a group of people, right? When people are reading your app, they're individual humans who are assigned to your application, who are probably doing this at home after they've worked a 36-hour shift. They're tired, they might have had a drink, they're sitting down, they're doing this for the first time. If they're doing it, they are volunteering for sure. So you've got to remember your audience. It's going to be subjective. They're going to have preferences no matter how well that school trains them. There's going to be some degree of subjectivity here. So which one is most important? I think that depends on the context of the story and also the person reading your application. I would be totally lying to you if I told you this process isn't subjective. I saw that firsthand. That was one of the most disheartening parts of this process. Is a lot of it is kind of like luck of the draw. It's kind of a crapshoot in terms of where you get accepted. That's why most California applicants apply to about 30 schools. And if you get how many interviews would it take to make you happy if you applied to 30 schools? What would be the number where you're like, yes, I was successful? I'm just curious. That's what most people say, Nicholas. Yeah, so most people say, like, if I get 5 interviews out of 30 schools, I think you're doing pretty well. That's a good number. But if you apply to 30 schools and you get 5 interviews, that means 25 people didn't like you, right? 25 people either put you on hold or said no. So you're always going to meet people who aren't going to like your application. That is 100% going to happen. And you are not going to control how other people whether they like you or not. But what you can control is how many competencies you show. And if we assume the med schools are training their admissions committee on looking for the competencies, then it's increasing your chances that people will say yes to you, because if they're using the competencies, then you've given them what they're looking for. So that's like something you have in your control, right? We can't control the biases they have. We can't control their preferences. But if they're trained to do this and you're doing it, that's some connection you can make. If I assume all of you, if you're applying this cycle, have already asked for your letters of rec, but if not, or you're applying next cycle, go ahead and Google the AAMC Letter Writer Guide. It's a really nice handout that you can give to your letter writers that highlights these competencies, and it kind of explains to the letter writers how you can use these competencies in the letter of rec. That's the expectation, that the letter writers are speaking to your competencies in the letters. Sometimes students are asked to write their own letters. That happens. If that happened to you, then look at this letter writer guide and try to understand how those competencies could be illustrated through the experiences you had with that person. So takeaway, and secondary, same thing. You're going to have stories. You're going to tell lots of stories, and you're always going to think about these competencies. So we only have 5 minutes. This isn't a super talkative group, so I don't know how this is going to go, but these are some words that I really hope you will write down, unless any of you would like to do my vocab time. Does anybody know what any of these words mean? If you want to unmute yourself and answer this. I told you what cultural humility means. Can anybody tell me what social determinants of health are? Okay. Well, I want you to write these words down, and I want you to look them up, Google them, and I want you to keep these things in your mind as you're writing your application, because this is also another lens through which you should be maybe thinking about what you're saying in your application. And if you have the language and the conceptual understanding as you're writing your app, I think it would be really helpful so that you are being very deliberate about what you're saying. Sometimes people are telling stories that are kind of dancing around these issues, but they're not really hitting it on the head in terms of, this is what I want to do when I grow up. If you can directly say, as a physician, I want to address the social determinants of health, and know what you're talking about because you understand what they are, that might be attractive because you're in the know, right? And then just some basic questions I want to make sure everybody knows. When do the schools open your app to read them? They open your app after you have submitted your secondaries, your letters are in, and your test scores are in. So they don't open your app to read them before you submit your secondaries. They usually filter and send people secondaries based on filters. So you have until the end of July when most schools are, before they're reading your application. That's a long time still. So you have plenty of time to think about these things and do your secondaries. If you've already done your personal statement and you're completely done, you're not touching it, that's fair. You still can take this approach with the other parts of your app. Are they legally required to read your entire application? No, unfortunately not. So they can close your app at any point, and we want to try to engage them as long as we can. If someone opens up your grades, they're going to look through your grades going down. They're not reading across. They're going to read down. So they'll see, let's say they open up your grades. They see some C's at the beginning. They're going to skip it, go straight to the bottom. They're going to look from the bottom up and make sure that you have A's at the end. If you have A's at the end, then they're going to keep going. They're going to keep reading. And so by the time they get to the end of let's say they get to your experience writing, they get to your personal statement, do you think it's a good idea to talk about your bad grades in your personal statement? Yes or no? Good idea to talk about bad grades in your personal statement. What do you think? No, that is correct, Nicholas. Although it's not a confident no from you, but I'll take it. So the reason why you should not talk about your bad grades in your personal statement is if they can't get past your grades, like let's say your grades are so bad that they just can't get past it, they just don't think you're going to do okay in med school, they're never going to read your personal statement. They're going to stop reading as soon as they see your grades. But if they get past your grades and they get to your personal statement, then they've already forgiven your grades. They've already gotten past it. So now they're just trying to figure out, why should I invite this person to interview? So if they're on your personal statement, they've gotten past your biographic info section, your grades, your experience writing. That's pretty deep in your app. Why would you want to remind them at that point that you have any flaws? They're just looking for reasons to say no to you because they have so many applications. They're screening people out, not screening people in. So they're looking for something to say no to. Don't remind them in your personal statement that you have any deficiencies, right? We're trying to sell the idea that you are going to bring value to the school. So if you want to talk about your grades, you can do it in your secondaries. If they say, is there anything that we should be concerned about, you can do that. Do not talk about a B- as a bad grade. Okay, I'm going to talk more about secondaries later. I'm just dropping things now. Okay, so I'm out of time. I'm going to quickly wrap up. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing a session from 9 to 12. It's an upcoming applicant retreat. I'm going to go through everything A to Z, not so much this, but a little bit of this, but mostly just everything about getting ready to apply. It's going to go fast. Bring all of your questions, tell your friends, and I will see you then. You can register on the HPAC website. All of our upcoming events are on there, so just like you found this one, make sure you're checking that regularly. I do offer one-on-one. I do it during HPAC's drop-ins, so on Wednesdays from 2 to 4 your time. I am online. Last week I sat there for 2 hours. I only saw 2 people. So if you want some one-on-one help with your personal statement or experience writing or COVID statement or disadvantage statement or anything at all, come to that and I'm happy to help you there. Sound good? Alrighty then. Well, thank you so much for coming, and if you have any questions, please bring them to drop-ins. I'm happy to answer them there, and otherwise, have a wonderful day. I'll hopefully see you tomorrow morning.